Hello and welcome back to Sunday Sweet Chats. I'm so excited to be starting season 2 here with you all. My name is Charles K. Carter, and I'm a queer poet who currently lives in Oregon. My latest chapbook is coming out very, very, very soon from Finishing Line Press, and it's called Artificial Sweetness. But that's enough about me. Let's talk about our sweet guest today and discuss some sweet, sweet poetry. Thank you for being here, Gwen. You are one of my favorite poets. I'm so excited you're here. Can you tell us a little more about yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I am currently teaching writing at Montana State University Northern, up in central Montana. I have an MFA from Minnesota State Mankato and also an MA in creative writing from Hollins University. So feel really lucky to have had some really good teachers along the way. Yeah, and I just published my third book of poetry, so excited about that too.
All right. Before we get too deep into the poetry, since it's Sunday Sweet Chats, we have to know what satisfies your sugary sweet urges when you have them.
I'm in Havre, Montana, and we have a drive-in called Rod's Drive-In, and they have really good chocolate milkshake. So that's kind of a go-to treat. My husband said, I went through the other day and I told them at the drive-through, I told my husband, I just go to work and I go home. And he said, and Rod's Drive-In. And I said, oh yeah, Rod's Drive-In too. Yeah, I guess that is a stop. So
Love it. Let's move on to poetry. You have a poem to read for us. Go for it.
yeah, so this is from the new book, which is Never Be the Same, and it's out from FutureCycle Press. And I just want to say that I think, especially for poetry, small presses, tiny presses can be wonderful because they really take the time with your project, and they, really went through this collection with a fine-tooth comb, and I just really appreciate it so much. So the poem I thought I'd read is called The Devil's Kettle, and The Devil's Kettle is a waterfall that's in northern Minnesota, north of Duluth, and it's a very unique waterfall, and then it comes down in two sections, and one part comes straight down and the other part disappears back into the rocks. So it's kind of cool. So there's an epigraph for this that I'm sure your listeners will recognize from Robert Frost that reads, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler, long I stood. So this is The Devil's Kettle. In June, the waterfall breaks through the ice of indecision and chooses all of the above. The rocks are efficient as a tailor with his scissors, cutting the waterfall neatly in two, letting one leg down and pinning the other up tight, like a white handkerchief a magician pushes back up his sleeve. The water falls everywhere and nowhere, rushing to explore two paths at once. Standing at the lower falls and looking up at the intricate rockwork, people murmur or watch in silence. Flat stones, plants trembling leaf by leaf in the mist. Like Robert Johnson, the river must have made a deal with the devil to take its music in so many directions. A chipped enamel washtub poured out, a white, starchy torrent of rain, an earthbound comet, rich as heavy cream. It needs no audience but the blackberries, runs day and night, breathless, the paint brimming the container, sloshing everywhere, doubling itself into twin travelers with no passports, suitcases flung over a cliff, white shirts and rumpled nightclothes tumbling collar over ruffle, over hem, all joy, all encore, a torrent of yeses overpowering every no.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful piece. One thing I really appreciate and absolutely love about your work and think you're a master of is bringing life into themes that seem very overdone or very difficult to approach. Nature poems been done over and over again, but you brought life into it, and I love how you brought pop culture in it with Robert Johnson and kind of the mythology of that. And not necessarily this poem, but you are a master of the love poem, which is
Oh,
really freaking hard to write a love poem and not sound like a Hallmark card, but you do it. And I think some of it is being so specific in pop culture and bringing that into it, which there are some poets who are like, no, it should be timeless. We shouldn't see those things, but
right.
it's so beautiful to see those things intertwined, and it brings it to life, and
You know,
makes it so fresh.
a book I would recommend is William Baer, Baer, I think is his last name, and it's writing. I think it's just called Writing Metrical Verse, and it's a wonderful book about to learn forms and to learn meter. But he says throughout that book, don't write pop culture, no pop culture, only write about ancient Greek myths. And so I went through the book, on my own, and every chapter I was like, okay, gonna write about you know, milkshakes, gonna write about. I mean, I just was sort of subverting that throughout the whole thing. So even though it's this really wonderful book with great advice, I think sometimes putting your own spin on it is the key to making it, as you said, maybe not cliche or not sweet, but not saccharine, to the point that it isn't interesting. So
Yeah, and I think that's great advice, especially if like anyone who's listening who's a newer writer, like if you hear a conversation, like take what works for you and forget the rest, because you will hear very successful writers, this works for them and the opposite works for someone else. Like take what works for you, disregard the rest. But listen to what other people have to say, because they might have some little nuggets or tricks that'll really appeal to you, and if you run with it, you might make magic. I think experimentation and being open to new things. Like generally I write free verse, but sometimes playing around with form, I'll create something I never would have otherwise. So yeah, great stuff. So tell us more about this book, and you also have a new literary journal. Tell us
yes.
more.
So the book Never Be the Same, it was as I said, it's my third book, and I sort of struggled for a while thinking about how to put it together, what the title should be, and I ultimately ended up calling it Never Be the Same because I think it has some themes of kind of shape shifting in there. Even the waterfall poem that I just read, it's the waterfalls going two directions and doing different things simultaneously. So that idea of kind of shape shifting was really interesting to me. And as I mentioned, the FutureCycle Press, I think for poetry, don't be afraid, don't hesitate to look at small presses that will, if they like your work, they'll pick it up and they will really focus on it. And it's been a really good experience working with them. And the literary journal I'm super excited about. So it's Bear Paw Arts Journal, and you can find us just at bearpawartsjournal.com, or if you Google Bear Paw Arts Journal, it'll come up. We are accepting poetry and flash fiction and micro memoirs through September 1st. So our inaugural issue will come out in September. And I'm working on poetry. My husband, Roger Hart, who's a fiction writer with two short story collections published, he's working on fiction. And my friend, Becky Phelan Brooks, who has written both young adult novels and children's books and nonfiction, is working on the nonfiction for us. We've already started getting a lot of great submissions, and we're trying to accept things on a rolling basis. So keeping people informed as we can. And the journal is named after the Bear Paw Mountains, which are up here in north central Montana. They're not the big, huge mountains that people think of when they think of Montana. They're not the glacier, the peaks of glacier, but they're really beautiful, smaller mountain range. And I kind of had the idea of the journal being about those kind of the extraordinary in the ordinary, the thing you don't expect, because it's not so much a destination place, the Bear Paw Mountains, but if they're there, it's a really nice, it's a really beautiful and maybe unexpected find. It's the largest, it's Beaver Creek Park, and that I think it's the largest county park in the country, in the state. So it's beautiful with trails, and there's two mountain lakes and a river, and yeah, it's really pretty. So so we would absolutely love to have people who are listening submissions.
Awesome, thank you. Last question before we let you go today. In a world, this is a new question this season, because a lot of questions or conversations came up last season about mental health and well-being and self-care, and we're coming out of a very traumatic event for a lot of people, and it stirred up a lot. And there's a lot of salty stuff happening in the world still. What keeps you sweet in a world that is so salty at times?
I think that's a great question. And I'll say two things. One is, if viewers will Google Gwen Hart and Mud Season Review, they did a short, it's a typed interview with me about kind of anxiety and ways to deal with anxiety, and I even put a list of resources in there. So that would be a nice thing. It's quick. It's a nice thing for people to look at. And the other thing I think for me for staying sweet is reading other people's work, like staying in touch with poetry and reminding myself what's possible in poems, what poems can do, and staying excited, about poetry. I just came back from the Northwoods Writers Conference in Bemidji, Minnesota, and I worked with Keisha Kuipers, who is the editor of Poetry Northwest. And one of the things she said was when she was in grad school, she had a poem that in workshop that ended with a flower. And someone in workshop said, no, you can't do that. You can't end a poem with a flower. That's just too cute, whatever. And so then she wrote a whole series of poems that ended with a flower, should have took it up as a challenge. And also at this conference was Ross Gay, which people know for his Book of Delights, and Amy Nizuka Matatiel for her, I believe it's World of Wonder. So those were two writers talking about sort of finding these delightful or wondrous things in the world, and everything from small, tiny, things to big things. So I think for me, that's the key, is not staying just in my own head, but making sure that I'm paying attention to other poets, other writers, and sort of getting inspiration from their observations and their experiences.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for being here today, Gwen. It's been a sweet, sweet treat to have you. Thanks for tuning in to Sunday Sweet Chats. Catch another episode next Sunday. Bye, everyone.